and it's just really interesting. So we'll just kind of start to go through from here. So the horseshoe crab is named the horseshoe crab because of its shape, right? It's shaped like a horse's shoe, okay? And it's sometimes called a living fossil. And the reason why is because it really hasn't changed much anatomy-wise.
Your line is now muted.
45 million years, right? So this thing has been around for more than 100 million years before dinosaurs were around. Pretty intense, right? And so there's a couple of reasons why that's the case. One is it's got a real hardy exoskeleton. This thing is really built like a tank, right? Another thing is it's got no real direct food value to people. People don't like eating these things, and a lot of times species become in trouble or in peril when they're delicious to people. And then the third thing is that they have a very unique blood adaptation to pathogen, and because of that, it provides a very great service and value to people. We'll get into that in a little bit. Here we go. So where do you find the horseshoe crab? So the Atlantic horseshoe crab is, its range is outlined here in blue. So part of the Yucatan Peninsula and all the way from the Gulf of Mexico, like around Tampa, all the way up to Maine, right? And then there's three other species that you can find in Asia, anywhere from Japan around all the way to India. And so they basically are found off the coast in the water for the most part, except for when they're breeding. And now, how do horseshoe crabs kind of compare to true crabs? So horseshoe crabs actually are not considered real crabs, but they're called crabs because their limbs are very similar, right? So both of them have an exoskeleton, and they molt, right? That means that they will shed their shell when they actually get bigger, right? So every time they go through a growth spurt, their shell comes off, they get a little bit bigger, and then they do it again over a period of time. Now, true crabs, all true crabs have this thing called eyes on stalks. So these eyes are actually protruding out sort of like on a bulb, right? And all true crabs have that. The horseshoe crab does not. The eyes are built into the exoskeleton. Crabs have antennae. Horseshoe crabs, nope. Crabs have traditional gills. Horseshoe crabs have this thing called book gills. These are the gills here. They look like pages of a book that actually helps them swim through the water and respirate on wet sand when they're out nesting. Traditional crabs have 5 sets of appendages. Horseshoes have 7. Traditional crabs can be quite delicious. This is a blue claw crab. If you've ever had one before, they can be pretty tasty. And as I mentioned before, horseshoe crab, not very palatable to people. Let's see here. Okay, so here is a view of the anatomy of a typical horseshoe crab. So you've got a bunch of different sets of eyes. Compound eyes are these two here, and scientists have looked at these compound eyes and studied them and have been able to extrapolate findings on human eyes, so they've been valuable in that way. In the front, they have simple eyes, which help them tell the difference between day and night. The top of their shell is called the carapace, much like a turtle. They have a hinge here, where their back area here can move back and forth. They have these movable spines to help protect them, and this telson or tail, which helps them flip over should they ever be flipped on their backside on land. The structures of the first leg are shown here. The female's first legs are a claw that look like the breast, whereas the male has this thing called a clasp. It almost looks like a punching glove. We'll get into those a little bit later. So here we'll talk about the legs. The first walking leg is where you'll see the difference between the male and the female. Then you have walking legs after that, and the pusher leg kind of helps them push them along. Book gills, as I discussed before. So let's keep going. So here's a question, and feel free to put this in the chat. Okay, does this look like a male or a female? Quiz for everybody. Okay, Damon says female. Graham says male.
Female.
Lots of females. Lots of people saying female. All right.
Hello? Wait.
Okay. What about this one? Does this look like a male or female? Once again, take a look at that front appendage. Okay. All right, so it looks like folks pretty much have it. The first one was a female because that front group of legs is very similar to the rest. This is a male. This thing is a clasper, and it's built that way to house the muscle inside because the males will actually attach themselves to the tail end of the female during the breeding season. When the females are out and broadcasting their eggs, the males are there to help germinate, to proliferate. And this is kind of like on the beach. So okay, once again, if we could go ahead and mute our phones. Keep going. Okay, so this is what I would see in Long Island growing up, walking along the beach, and it could get pretty substantial there, right? So females are generally larger, almost 3 times the size of males, and the big reason why is because they carry a lot of eggs. It takes them about 10 years to mature, and they live on average 20 years, but sometimes they could live up to 40 years. The spawning usually begins in late April, and it goes through mid-August, and peaks in late May to June. The biggest times, the most activity that you'll see for these species is during the high tides around the full moon. And the reason why is full moon, the light comes through the water. It kind of triggers the horseshoe crabs to know when's the best time to get out on land and avoid predators. Okay? So as I mentioned, high tides, they migrate from deep water to beaches to spawn. The female will dig a nest in the sand and deposit eggs, and the male will fertilize those eggs. At low tide, adult crabs will go back into the water. So they come in with the tide, they try to go out with the tide. I don't know who this is, but I'm going to decline that. Horseshoe crab spawning increases, right? So with the new moon, and when gravity is stronger and high tides are higher. All right. So that's what they had here, and so this is what their eggs look like. They're green eggs, and they'll lay up to 4,000 eggs in each nest, and a female will lay up to 88,000 eggs during a full nesting season. These eggs could be pretty important food for shorebirds that are migrating along the Atlantic coast. And a lot of shorebirds have actually evolved to have their migrations coincide with the spawning of horseshoe crabs. I remember hearing that you all have been talking a little bit about evolution, right? So it's a key point there. So as far as value is concerned, like what is so valuable about horseshoe crabs and why should we protect them? Well, one thing for sure, you want to protect things like this because they're valuable to other species. You could consider a horseshoe crab to be what's called a keystone species, where a lot of other species depend on them, including some threatened and endangered species, which we'll get into in a little bit. But one thing that's really neat about the horseshoe crab, is that they have a direct benefit to people, right? And it's all based on their blood. So does everyone see this blue liquid here in these jars? That is actually horseshoe crab blood. That is actually blood in those containers. It's crazy, right? So it's blue. And the reason why it's blue is because they have something, a copper-based compound in their blood called hemocyanin. Not like people, we have iron in our blood, hemoglobin, and that's why it's red. Right? So they don't have an immune system like we do. We have a very complex immune system that has evolved to help us avoid getting sick. The horseshoe crab is very basic, but it's incredibly effective, and one of the reasons why they've been around for so long. And so they develop antibodies, and they fight bacteria in that way. And so their blood will actually clot upon detecting bacteria endotoxins of any kind, be it fungus, the virus, or bacteria. And their blood includes LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate. which will bind to those pathogens. Right? And so this also, the clotting will form a physical barrier, and it will help keep any of these toxins from getting into their system. Right? And so if you've ever had a needle stuck in you, or anything, even like a heart valve pieces of equipment, these items are all tested with the blood of a horseshoe crab to ensure that they are clean and sterile. Right? And so before they're put out to the medical industry. So everyone who's ever gone to the doctor and had a shot, vaccine or anything, has benefited from horseshoe crabs, which is pretty fantastic. As far as conservation concerns are concerned, there are threats to the species. Historically, they were used and harvested for fertilizer, so they were captured in this way. You can see in the picture, and then shredded up into tiny little pieces and put out on farm fields. And so I think some of this still does happen, but not as much as it used to. But they are still used for bait for eels, whelks, and catfish. Although people don't eat them directly. I think we still have a hot mic. I hear some clicking. If we could go ahead and mute what we have going on there. Okay, so this is a picture of a Rufa red knot. This is a federally threatened species, and when a species gets listed in that way, it's afforded some level of protection, right? And so this species is there. They were listed about 5 years ago. Each spring, this species will migrate about up to 18,000 miles round trip, right? So 9,000 miles each way, and go back and forth between the central Canadian Arctic and the southern tip of South America, back and forth. That's a long flight, and the birds really need to get a lot of food stored in order to be able to fly that distance. And one of the biggest stopover places is Delaware Bay. You can see that down here, just basically south of where we are now. And so when the populations of horseshoe crabs started to go down in Delaware Bay, so did the population of red knot. So the population of this species is closely tied to the ability of the horseshoe crab to survive and thrive in the environments that they're known to occur in now. As far as path forward, so as I mentioned, Delaware hosts the largest population of horseshoe crabs in the world, second largest population of migrating shorebirds in North America. So it's not just the red knot; it's a bunch of other birds out there that benefit from all these eggs that are broadcast out there by the horseshoe crab. And so things that people are trying to do at this point, conservation-minded folks like myself, is protect their spawning ground. And limit the trawling activities. Trawling is basically when people go out with fishing nets that have weights on them, significant weights on the bottom, to help sort of clear the bottom of the ocean or sea or wherever they are, and pick all that up and capture it in the net. It's really good for bottom-feeding animals, benthic animals, and marine life. And it's a great way to go shrimping and crabbing and clamming. So those activities are limited during the spawning season, and that has been a big plus for this species. And they also conduct a population census. We've actually gone out in the field and put, if you can see this here, this is actually a tag on the side of an adult horseshoe crab. And these are actually lady slipper barnacles that are stuck to the back. So these species also act as a school bus, so to speak, to bring other animals around into different places. And so when you tag an animal like this, be it a horseshoe crab or a deer or anything, and you let it go, you could come back years later and recapture. And when you do, the number of recaptured tags that you find will give you some pretty accurate numbers on how the population is doing. And if you're doing this over a period of time, you could really deduce trends. Is the population decreasing? Is it growing? Things like that. And you account for things like normal mortality. So it's a very effective tool that conservation and wildlife practitioners use to sample populations. That's basically what I have for the presentation. Pretty short but sweet and I just kind of wanted to cover, a species that I thought would be beneficial to talk about for the class.